Hi, everyone. If I could have your divided attention. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Grace Byron, a writer from Indiana, which is one of the states in the Midwest, and based now in Queens, New York. Grace writes about various things, about novelists such as Thomas Pynchon and Patricia Lockwood, pop stars, think Lorde and Taylor Swift, and also about artists such as Pippa Lodi-Riss and Sarah Lucas and others, and other cultural phenomena, television and trends, for some of the more interesting media outlets that are still in business. The New Yorker, New York Magazine, Art Forum, Frieze, Vogue, Book Forum, The Nation, The Baffler, Joyland. Oh, Frieze was already in there. The Los Angeles Review of Books, known as LARB. Her debut novel, Herculine, published earlier this month, October 7th, by Saga Press, tells the story of a trans woman who flees New York to join a trans commune in, you guessed it, Indiana, only to find it haunted by both figurative and literal demons. Full disclosure, some of the words I just read and some of the words in the next sentence are poached from Google's AI bot. The book blends literary horror with social commentary on trans identity and community. In a recent interview in Bomb magazine, Leah Abrams, who was interviewing Grace, said, "I kept thinking as I reread that the horror framing could not be more relevant. We live in times that feel like horror," Grace replied. We live in times that feel like horror. Oh, I'm sorry. That was all Leah. And then Grace replied, "Horror is uniquely suited to our current moment." Hell yes. Grace was a recipient of the Queer Art Mentorship in 2024, which led, I think, to this novel. And she is represented by Julia Masnick, a literary agent at Watkins Loomis. She received a BA from Indiana University, IU. Please give it up for Grace Byron.
Hello. How are we? Can we hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Are we doing good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. That was really great. I haven't had somebody ever write such a thorough bio of me before. It's really sweet. And thank you, Izzy, for getting everything set up here. This is sort of a modified version of an article that I wrote that sort of was something that I was working on for Spike magazine and kind of became, at a certain point, its own thing. I'm calling it Look Around, just kind of as a provocative statement, but I have spent a lot of my career writing about trans artists, also the sort of what is sometimes called the autobiographical imperative on trans artists, which just really means the way that a lot of minority artists are sort of called to make work about themselves as a way to sort of enforce legibility and meaning, and sort of as a way to, sometimes in a way that is fun and interesting. It's always fun to sometimes make art about yourself or your community, but also can be sort of a trap or sort of a enforcement. And I think sometimes that self-portraiture can be a really beautiful thing. It can be a really vexed and complicated thing for different minorities throughout history. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about that today. This is something that is put in all of my talks, but Mark really did a great job already at introducing me. So I don't feel like you guys need to know this, but if you do want to find me on social media, my tag everywhere is Emo Trophy Wife. Okay, let's get started. So some of you may or may not know about a famous trans woman named Lily Elbe. Anybody ever heard of that name before? Cool. So she was actually, in the way that we now think about trans identity, she's sometimes considered one of the quote unquote first, right? However you want to think about that. Complicated. But she grew up in Germany in the Weimar Empire, sort of right before the Nazis came to power. She was in the Magnus Hirschfeld's clinic, if you've ever sort of heard of that. It was this very famous place where this doctor was sort of trying to help trans people get surgeries and hormones and sort of transition both socially and physically. And so she was one of his early patients, and she was actually a painter. So I think something that's interesting is the way that early trans people of a certain kind were sort of already making art about themselves and other people. On the right, you can see a portrait of Lily Elbe that was actually made by her lover. And on the left, you can see a painting that Lily Elbe herself created. She was not somebody who necessarily was doing a lot of self-portraits, but I am sort of starting here because I think it's interesting to think about the ways that already trans people had a vexed and complicated relationship to depicting themselves in art. Most of the paintings that Lily Elbe made herself were actually of like landscapes, or here you can sort of see, this is just kind of a still life that she did. And she actually stopped painting once she started to get surgeries and transition. Which again, fascinating. And she actually passed away because Magnus Hirschfeld tried to perform a womb transplant on her, which is obviously a very, very complicated procedure that we still cannot do. But at the time in the 30s and 40s, they were sort of trying to experiment and see what was possible. This is a much more recent, potentially trans self-portrait. This is a painting by Nash Glynn. She lives in New York. She works downtown. She's represented by a very prestigious gallery. And she's been interviewed in Art Forum by Hari Nef and plenty of trans celebrities. A lot of her work is self-portraiture, almost all of it. Usually they're in these sort of like loose, beautiful, different sort of abstract spaces. Sometimes there's unicorns or rainbows even. I sort of chose this one. I think it's a little bit more tasteful. I really like Nash's work. I think she's a really great painter. But I think this is sort of a great place to start to think about trans self-portraiture. She is very commercially successful, right? So I'm going to sort of talk about a variety of trans artists, some of whom are really successful and some of whom are potentially not. But I think when you think about trans self-portraits, form is really interesting, right? A lot of times when work by trans people is written about, it's not written about for its form or representation. It's sort of written for its politics. And this is sort of a thing that has happened for a lot of minority art over the years, is like how important or groundbreaking is something versus thinking about the line work or the brush strokes or any sort of, formal inquiry. So I think, right, thinking about the different ways that trans portraits are thought about in terms of form and function, and sort of how oftentimes people want to believe that you can sort of imbue or sort of like read trans politics into these paintings. Whereas I think a lot of the artists I'm going to talk about sometimes really evade that. I think Nash is kind of, the painter of this painting, kind of has a middle ground approach, right? She is really clearly invested in sort of creating an archive of the self, right? Sort of throughout her life and her transition. But she is not necessarily going to make any grand political statements. Her work is not really about erasure or sort of like bravery or things like that, right? These are sort of like everyday paintings. This is a different painting. This is by a painter named Jalen Gomez, who's represented by Picao Gallery, also a downtown trans woman artist. Here, I think there's a little bit more of the sort of like how I think a lot of people come to think about trans art, which is like transformation and like self-identity and self-creation. I don't find this as compelling, personally. I think that Jalen, while I think is clearly a very talented painter, I think to me there's something about this that feels a little bit more one-to-one. Jalen has done a lot of portraits of trans women throughout the years, like Cecilia Gentili, who's a famous trans woman sex worker who I'll talk a little bit more about later. And she does a lot of like, she's done like glitter and she's sort of like painted hormone vials and things like that. So there are a lot of trans women painters who do sort of lean into this like autobiographical imperative and making work about their sort of daily lives and sort of that question. But there's a question here about, does visibility, does sort of like depicting trans people inherently, is that inherently political? Is that inherently revolutionary to just sort of make art about trans people? And I think that there's in our political climate, which is, I think, really anti-trans, especially right now, there's a lot of legislation against trans people being able to move freely, to get passports, to have healthcare. Some people might say, yes, just depicting a trans person is a sort of like radical act or is like a political engagement. I think I would push back on that. I think, it's cool, potentially to like make art about yourself and pencil, but I don't think that it inherently is like raising the stakes or giving people material resources and access. However, the counterpoint that somebody else might bring up about this is that recently, maybe you followed this, maybe you didn't, but thinking about the ways that painting and art gets politicized and legislated, this is a painting by Amy Sherald, who's a very famous painter, who recently was about to have a show at the Smithsonian. And this piece is called Transforming Liberty. And it is depicting a Black trans woman as the Statue of Liberty. And because of this, the Smithsonian got a lot of flack from the president and also the administration in general, who said, we will not fund this show at the Smithsonian since the Smithsonian is a governmental body. And they said, unless you pull this piece from the show, we're not going to have this show. Or at least there was like a line of threatening, right? How much they were going to allow this to happen. And Amy Sherald, in her defense, said, I'm going to actually pull the show preemptively. So before, deciding whether or not to include this piece, Amy Sherald pulled the show entirely. And then it became the cover of The New Yorker. The New Yorker decided that they were going to use this image as their cover, and this is something that I ended up writing sort of a piece about for The New Yorker. And so in a way, right, this was like a quite powerful act of protest, both the fact that she ended up pulling the show, the fact that she was also depicting a American icon, the Statue of Liberty, as a trans person. Right, so there is some element of the ways that trans portraits are politicized throughout history. So I'm going to go back in history again. Does anybody know who these people are? Any of them? Even one? Yeah.
Is it Candy Darling?
It is, yeah. So on the far right, you have Candy Darling holding a lollipop that says "Love Me." Candy Darling was a movie star, an actress who was often working in Andy Warhol's club and sort of menagerie of women and actresses. The other two are also two sort of famous Warhol darlings. I think that Candy Warhol is kind of one of the biggest still, and sort of one of the people who is still talked about a year ago. There was a biography that came out about her, if you want to learn more about her. But in thinking about the ways that trans women choose to represent themselves and sort of become producers of their own images, she had a very complicated relationship working with Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol taught her in many of his films, had a complicated relationship with her throughout her life and his. But she was kind of another sort of early trans-ish celebrity, or she was trans, but celebrity-ish person, right? The average person in the world maybe didn't know about her. Now I think a lot of people do know about her. At the time, she was more sort of New York famous or downtown famous. But she was involved in these films and sort of like helping write the scripts. But at the same time, a lot of what she was allowed to say and do was sort of boxed into this thing. She really wanted to be sort of like an old Hollywood glamorous like movie star. And that was the kind of roles that she tried to audition for. But she didn't really get that. She kind of was sort of stuck in these sort of DIY art films that Warhol was making. So even in the 60s and 70s, right, there was already this kind of conversation around who gets to be a producer of their image, who gets to sort of like have a legacy, who gets to sort of like be allowed in what spaces, and who gets to have that much control, which is sort of, I think, a theme that you're going to see throughout the history of trans women portraiture and things like that. Moving into the 90s, we have Gur Langton. And this is obviously not a self-portrait, but I bring in Gur Langton because she was an artist also in the downtown scene before. She was not a painter. She was primarily a doll maker and sculptor. And she made these really, provocative images. These are heels, obviously, with nails in them. This is her doing a bust of Candy Darling, and in the middle of it, sort of referencing that other image of Candy Darling, it says "Love Me" in the middle. So she made all these dolls, often of other trans women, she made dolls of hermaphrodites, she made dolls of monsters, she made dolls of people having sex. She made sort of these really provocative, like life-size dolls. They were huge. They're hard to find. They're not all in circulation now. She does have an archive that's in Pittsburgh. And occasionally she would also make dolls both of herself and of her husband and of other people that she knew. And she had a lot of image issues. The work that she made is sometimes really described as like monstrous or grotesque sometimes. These are some of the more tame images. If you Google Greer Langton, you'll sort of see that her work really spans the gamut. So I think kind of early on in the 80s and 90s, you can see a lot of trans men weren't necessarily painters. I'm about to sort of get into that, and that's why I sort of wanted to start by talking about painters, but sort of go back and sort of talk about the role that trans women had to owning their image, because I think that's a sort of important context for what's coming. This is Cecilia Gentili, so I referenced her before. She passed away about a year or two ago. And I think that the other thing that's really important to think about when you're thinking about how trans women make art is the fact that a lot of times they don't get to own their legacy. They don't get to own how things go. Candy Darling passed away very young. Her parents were not really happy about the fact that she was trans, and her funeral, right, was a really complicated thing where Warhol was kind of trying to make sure people were recognizing her as a woman, and her parents were sort of trying to make sure that that was not happening. And Greer Langton had a similar thing. And Greer Langton's archives are housed in two different spaces, one by an abusive ex-husband and one sort of by a museum. So there's a lot of complications. Cecilia Gentili was a really fierce advocate in the trans community. She made a lot of plays. She was a big part of the sort of push to decriminalize sex work in New York. She was a really magnificent woman. And I think that there's a lot of mourning that has to be talked about too in the world that like happens with a lot of these trans women. A lot of them died really young. Cecilia, she passed away only a year ago, and obviously things are very different now than when Greer Langton or Candy Darling died, but they're not that much better now in a lot of ways too. Anybody know who this is? Trickier. This is Vaginal Davis. She is alive, and she is an artist who's currently making work. She actually has a giant solo show at MoMA PS1 right now. She has made a lot of films. She has made a lot of paintings. She has done a lot. The image on the right is a portrait that she collaborated on with Catherine Opie, a famous lesbian photographer, if you know her. And I just think it's sort of good to get a lay of the land of like who's working, who was doing different work, what kind of work they're doing. All right, so kind of into the meat of it. You kind of now have a sense of the different shapes and kinds of art that trans women have made, a few of the sort of stars and what their vibe was. This is Cielo Felix Hernandez, who I think is one of the best painters currently working now. She also is represented by a downtown gallery. She is a Bricois painter. And what I like about her self-portraits is that they're a little bit more, how do I say it? They're a little bit more artistic, right? Like some of the earlier ones that I showed you, it's sort of a one-to-one realistic representation of what's happening. But in Cielo Felix Hernandez's work, right, there's some elements that you can start to parse in terms of craft, right? There's a really magnificent use of color, right? She's using these sort of tassels on the sides. Her brushwork, I think, is really crazy. And right, these things are also sort of like sculptural in terms of the patterns that they're doing. I think something that I think it's important to stress is that I think it's important to push back on the idea that trans self-portraiture is radical in and of itself, because I think you could do more, right? You can just do more with the form of portraiture. And I think that Cielo is somebody who I think is painting who are really great, and they are in that kind of like trans is beautiful lineage. But I think that they still have an element of like craft and inspiration, and they're just really rich images, and they're very lyrical. But they're still very optimistic too. And so those are sort of three paintings by Cielo that I wanted to sort of let you see. Right. So these, there's lots of like flowers and tattoos and acrylic nails and sort of bubbly colors and nods to heritage. But I don't think that these, even if they are sort of like radiating trans joy, that they're necessarily like sickly sweet. And Cielo Felix Hernandez's paintings, actually, the show that she had, her first big solo show was called Sweet and Sour, just because she was kind of representing, I think, both sides of that. Um, and so yeah, so like these are great. I think a lot of these people are sort of in the lineage of like Nicole Eisenman or Salman Tor or Carrie James Marshall. There's sort of like a beautiful sheen to the paints and the representations of people, real importance paid to how people look, how people are lit, that I think kind of carries over from photography. And there's a lot of flowers in them and all of these things. So these, I think, are people, oftentimes also like a lot of trans portraits, I think the figures are looking back at you, right? There's a sort of challenge, which is sort of the thing that I want to get into next, is that there are a lot of different things that I think portraiture can do, right? The sort of gaze can be benevolent or benign, or it can have like a harsh edge. It can sort of subvert your expectations. It can sort of obscure something, or sort of magnify, or enhance, or negate, or guard, or hold. I think all of these verbs are things that portraiture has the power to do, but doesn't always do. Okay, this is another downtown painter, but not all downtown painters, I promise. This is Willa Wasserman, who's represented by Francois Gabali. And Willa, I think, does something really interesting in that her work is really slippery. It's really almost illegible, right? The form is really tricky, ghostly, ghastly. There's kind of a blurriness to it. I think like there's almost an artistic strategy of being difficult to read. There's sort of something about subverting and obscuring that is a sort of artistic way of pulling the viewer off balance, right? And I think a lot of times people come to trans art expecting something really digestible or easy, or even a message. And I think someone like Willa Wasserman is really anti-message and is really pro-form. And that's something that there's an extreme to this, right? You have like trans artists who sort of obscure or sort of like eschew doing portraiture altogether. You have lots of trans abstract artists like Sarah Serpis or Jamie Nair or Creighton Baxter, Lee Churchman. But then you have a few people like Willa Wasserman or other folks who sort of go in the middle, right? There is a foreground, there is like a figure, there is land, but it's not easy necessarily to see what's going on. You really have to pay attention. And in this, it's kind of almost skeletal, right? So there's also some meditation on mourning and death in there. This is another one of hers, right? You can kind of see there's like kind of a naked, potentially trans woman in there. But again, it's also really like dulled down and blurry, and there's the brushstrokes are crazy and frenetic in this way that I think is really lush and beautiful. One of Willow's most recent shows at Francois Gabali, she sort of made all of these different X portraits. So they're all self-portraits, but they're all of her kind of mangling her body into these different positions. This one is her kind of being an X, right? So you can kind of see her hair dripping down and you can kind of see her limbs, but it's really like brutal and grotesque and lovely in this way that I think is really interesting. And while she's sort of using a really neutral, muddy palette, there's still just like a lot of color going on. It's just like a more muted tone. Now this I think is much less muted. This is Agnes Walden, who is currently not represented, but has been at a bunch of art fairs in the past few years. I really love this piece. That is like crazy. Like it's sort of like a Hephaestus drawing on Greek mythology, drawing on self-transformation. But again, like the figure in the foreground are very muddy, white, it's really red, it's really grotesque. There's something that you could read like trans metaphors of surgery or the body or whatever into, but it's still really, I think, confronting you with this idea of like making and meaning making and how much meaning you can make out of a painting. I think a lot of people come to trans portraiture and they want to sort of come away with like, oh, I get it. I've experienced the other side. I've experienced another person's life or identity. And I think that a lot of the art I'm trying to show today and to talk about, I think is really like well, what if it was more complicated than that? Like, what if the lives we lead are really messy and there's a lot going on and they're not just one thing? Um, this one is another one by Agnes Walden called Piss Fountain, which I think is just really delightful. Yeah. And then you have people who I think radically are just confrontational. Does anyone know who this painting is by? Forrest Bass. Yeah. Who said that? Nice. So Forrest Best, right, I'm kind of taking a left turn here because Forrest Best, if you know who he was, not technically a trans woman, but a lot of people have a lot of complicated feelings about him. And so I think this is another big thing that's interesting about the sort of history of gender or transness, is that who counts as trans, who counts as sort of a gender outlaw? Because the modern formation of what counts as trans is a relatively modern phenomena. You know, before the 1900s, cross-dressing was kind of as close as you got. Like there weren't surgeries necessarily. And so somebody could be trans in a lot of different ways or not trans, right? It's kind of a word that people made up to sort of collate a population. That could include a lot of different kinds of people. So the sort of traditional model of I'm transitioning from one gender to another through the use of drugs or hormones is a fairly modern invention that sort of started in the 20s and 30s. And a lot of trans historians are like, who counts as trans? And I think that's an important question to ask. And I think you can always read onto the past, like who is what. All that said, Forrest Bass is an interesting person because Forrest Bass sort of performed surgeries on himself. He sort of forcibly castrated himself, among other things. And he made a lot of really quizzical, strange, weird art. And there's been a real like resurgence of his work in the past few years. He's been covered in magazines like Ursula or Art Forum and etc. Sort of reappraisal of his work and what it might mean in terms of thinking about gender. And a lot of his work is really phallic. It sort of like seems to represent sex. And in his writings, he sort of was a maniacal writer. He talks a lot about gender and the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And he was kind of a weirdo. But I think he was interesting for that. And I think there's a way that his paintings, I think, really resist thinking about them in this one-to-one autobiographical way. Because you could look at this and say, okay, what is this? A bleeding penis, a bleeding like phallic image? Is this sort of like any of those things? And you could read that into his work. And you know, if you look at all of his paintings across time, I think it's clear he was obsessed with bodies and how those live, but they're really abstract. And so I think there's also a way that his work can really sort of push back on that in a way that I think is interesting to think about. There's also, I don't have any paintings by this artist, but there's also an artist named Shelley Atwater, who I think is an interesting person to think about in this terms, who really makes these really nightmarish, weird paintings of attics. And she's represented by another downtown gallery. And I felt like I had done enough of them. But if you want more, she is another one who is good, I think, to sort of look at. So I think this painting is called Eye of God, by the way. And I think that he kind of hints at this like sort of gender variance and this cryptic element that is sort of a theme in a lot of these different artists, and I think really is resisting narrative. And there's a sort of negation. There's a real hostility, I think, to the viewer. And so a lot of these artists, I think, are playing with the gaze that we bring to their art. Like, what are we looking for from their art? What suspicions are we want confirmed? What are we afraid of? What are we wanting to lean into? And I think a lot of them also are sort of wanting to sort of neutralize that gaze or that curiosity, or at least sort of redirect it, right? This is another artist. Should I ask again? Anybody know who this one is? Just had a huge show at the New Museum before it closed. This is Puppies Puppies, which is her sort of stage name. She is mostly a performance artist, but she also does a lot of like sculpture and really bizarre like pieces and performances. I think she's like a much weirder like Marina Abramovich. She did this long sort of performance piece at the New Museum where she made everything green, which is what this image is from. And she made herself a bedroom in the museum, and she allegedly stayed there for like that was her home. Like she stayed in the New Museum for as long as she could. And she is a trans woman. And she sort of hung like trans flags and Greek flags and Two-Spirit flags, and like sort of like did like a sort of like takeover of the new museum to think about both the color green and also identity. Um, and I found it strange that I ended up going to the show and reviewing it, but she was almost never actually there. It's like she promised she was going to be there all the time. There are going to be all these performances, and she was just never there. And so then I started to think like, oh, is that the point? Like, is the point she's sort of like offering us her life or her identity, or sort of like she sort of claimed that she was going to like bring her friends in and like do video chats and like even like bring lovers there or whatever. And I have heard very few people who actually ended up seeing her there. So I wondered if that was almost the point of the performance, was this sort of like denial of her giving herself to us, and sort of this like resistance to the girl boss imagery, or like the resistance to the sort of personal. Um, because sometimes she is really, really confrontational. Like she also made this statue that got her in a lot of trouble with authorities when it went up in Europe. This is a statue that is presumably of herself naked, and then at the bottom it says woman. So she's also, I think, sometimes she's a very political artist. I think, you know, she does often do the sort of personal and autobiographical. She has sort of written a lot about transitioning. She once like did an art show that was like a funeral to her old name and her old life as a, you know, other person. Um, so I think that that's another element too, that there are certainly people who I think do a good job of like, yes, I'm going to give you the personal, but I'm also going to give it to you in this kind of like informational or bitter or angry way, in a way where you're also still sort of forced to learn. Bobby Sobies has a lot of like takeovers of things too, where she sort of like will go into museums and force them to give people healthcare or like give them like free advice or things. It's really, she does like a lot of really interesting things with like what are the limits of the museum as a space for connection. Um, yeah, so I think overall, right, I've sort of talked about the different ways that like us looking at trans art can be potentially vampiric or sort of like sacrificial or cynical. And also I think the ways that it can be also like a space of like finding vulnerability or like kind of like connecting. And I think a lot of that depends on like what the different artist intends, which is, you know, obviously true. But I think that in the way that trans art often gets read and the need for it to be politically legible, I think that there's space for these more weird artists that often don't get lumped into the same kind of political art, even though their art I think is really beautiful and challenging in a way that is like interesting. Um, and I think that's hard because painting is sometimes ultimately sort of a commodity. Like it is an art form, but self-portraiturists are also sort of selling themselves. Like what if you are a portraiturist and you make, you know, an image of yourself, you are kind of selling yourself, which is sort of a tricky thing. So I think a lot of these artists play with that. They sort of know they're doing that to some degree in the art world, and potentially sort of like trading on their identity as a commodity. And so sometimes I think don't always play by the rules in a way that is interesting, the way that they sort of go back and forth between visibility and aggression and admiration and opacity and like all of these different things to sort of confront that. So there's sort of a lot of different methodologies for self-portraiture, especially within sort of trans art. Um, and I think that's maybe where we should leave it for now.